Hey, I'm Brian Schneider from Renaissance Golf Design, and I build golf courses for a living.
I mean, the game is an amateur game. I mean, the professional side of it, there are idols and heroes and fun to watch them play. But I mean, if it wasn't for amateur golf, there would be no golf.
On a nice day, it's very scoreable, and you go play it on a 15, 20 mile an hour day, and you're hanging on to your pants. And I think I love that about that style of golf, link style of golf.
You have to remember, when you play a golf course and you're out there for 4 hours or whatever, you're only hitting a ball for 15 minutes of that. So there's a lot of time to look around.
Welcome to the Top 100 Clubhouse podcast, Brian. It's great to have you on. We're also joined by the Top 100 regular in Jasper and head of the website. How are you doing, Jasper?
Yeah, doing well. Yeah, even better now. Great to have Brian on. So yeah, really good.
Yeah, it's an absolute.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're more than welcome, Brian. It's a joy to have you on. And I always like to start by the same kind of similar question, especially people with your standing, is how did golf start for you? Where did it all begin?
Yeah, I started when I was very young. My parents played. My grandfather played and played very well, and his brother owned a little par 3 course and driving range in my hometown. So my earliest memories of playing golf were I was probably 3 or 4 years old and going out there with my grandpa. And I have a memory of taking a backswing, not realizing he was right behind me and conking him in the head and splitting his forehead open at one point. But I was very little. Nonetheless, he continued to take me back. But yeah, I played for as long as I remember. Never well enough to make a living doing that. But yeah, I've played all my life. And I was really fortunate. The town I grew up in, Oshkosh, Wisconsin, we had a municipal course there, Lakeshore Municipal. And in the summertime, as long as we showed up, I think before 9 a.m., we could play all day for $3. So wow. All of the summer days were just, throw your bag over your shoulder and jump on your bike and off to the golf course and just hang out there for most of the day. So yeah, golf has been a part of my life for a long time and something I've always enjoyed.
What was the next step for you?
It took until college really to realize that this was even a career that existed, much less something I want to do for a living.
To be fair, there's not that many of you.
There aren't. No, it's a pretty small business and something I was entirely unaware of. It's back in the 80s and 90s. Golf architects didn't have the status they do now. Nobody cared that Winged Foot was designed by Tillinghast. They just thought it was a good, hard golf course. So, I recall, kind of as I was finishing college, I decided that, with the encouragement of my parents, decided that I wanted to take a stab at a career in golf. And, I'd always enjoyed traveling to see other golf courses, though I didn't have the ability to do much of that growing up. Most of my golf was kind of around where I lived in Wisconsin. But I enjoyed going out to see new golf courses and doodling holes and that sort of thing. So it was kind of towards the end of college that I shifted gears and what I thought I wanted for my career and decided I wanted to get into golf. And then, my first job post-college was working for a golf course superintendent in Kohler, Wisconsin at Black Wolf Run and Whistling Straits when they were building the Straits course. So I got to spend a lot of time every day just helping to maintain a golf course, and also a few afternoons a week got over to Whistling Straits to watch the construction of that project, which fascinated me. And, that's really where I decided, okay, this is something I think I'd like to do, without realizing in any way what it took to get to the point of actually doing that for a living. But I spent, kind of the next 4 years doing that same thing, working for golf course superintendents at clubs kind of across America. I had reached out to Tom Doak from Kohler. I went to the Sand Hills and got to meet Bill Core and talk with him a bit, and just kind of asked them, how do I get into your business? And they both said, just try and see as many golf courses as you can, and sort out in your own mind why you like this one better than that one and that sort of thing. but it was mostly just about seeing and studying golf courses. So I couldn't afford to run around and just play golf for a living that way. So my idea was, okay, I'll just keep working for superintendents at various spots across America. And, while I'm here, I'll see all the great golf courses I can see in this area. Once I feel like I've seen everything I want to see, send out some resumes, go on to the next part of the country, and just travel around America playing golf and studying golf that way. And got really lucky to work at a bunch of great golf courses in the process, and wake up every morning and mow greens and rake bunkers at some of the greatest courses in the world, which was, really was a wonderful way to learn how to build golf. How far you can push things and still be maintainable, or what's too far. And it was also a lot of fun. I got to play a bunch of great golf and travel the country. I made minimum wage for most of that time, and everything I owned fit in the back of my Mercury Cougar. But I got to play a bunch of golf. That's all I needed.
That's one of the cool things about golf course architecture is the inspiration is on the ground. It's not through books and a degree in golf, and I don't know what's landscape architecture. It's in actually going out and seeing these places and experiencing things. Why is that more important, the experience, over, say, a learning how to get rid of drainage?
They're both important. I think the quote is attributed to Pete Dye that 95% of golf architecture is making drainage look good. And, that's very much true. First and foremost, a golf course has to function properly.
Yeah.
And then it's, beyond that, you're just kind of dressing it up in a way that you feel looks appealing and presents interesting golf shots. But it has to function well, otherwise it's going to get changed. And maintaining golf courses was a great way to understand that. I didn't study engineering or landscape architecture in school, so I didn't have that formal background. But being on a golf course every day and fixing drainage issues, fixing irrigation issues, that was a great practical way to understand those elements of architecture, while also kind of gobbling up the strategic parts and the shaped built features and what makes some more interesting than others. So it was, just a practical, rather than learning in a classroom. I learned that by just being out on a golf course every day.
So do greenkeepers love you then?
I don't know about that.
Because you obviously got a lot of experience and understand their position.
Yeah, it certainly helps. But at the same time, in the stuff we build, we're often pushing the limits of what superintendents are comfortable with. And we've been so fortunate to work with great greenkeepers on so many of our projects. And usually from the beginning of the project and through construction, they're a part of it. And you're constantly bouncing ideas off of them. And, hey, this is pretty severe. You want to take a look at this and let us know if you think we need to dial this back. And, the best superintendents are the ones that say, you know what, I'm just here to maintain what you build. You build what you think is cool, and we'll figure out a way to take care of it. And we've been blessed with a lot of those guys over the years.
Have you had any difficulty? Any difficult learning experiences from things that you've built or things you've done and it hasn't worked or hasn't? Horrible question. Sorry.
There's undoubtedly some of that, though. I think our process. I think we operate in a way that minimizes those things. We spend so much time on site throughout the construction process that, when the golf course is grassed and open, there aren't many surprises. I think that's an important part of building your own golf. Not only do you get to build the features you want and the way you want to build them, but you're also on site to see what the golf course looks like, in the dirt after a 3-inch rain. It's like, well, shit. That we got to address that. That's a problem. So storms during construction are a problem, and they can be demoralizing. But at the same time, just being on site to see the repercussions of things like that allows you to make sure that any damage that's done during construction has been addressed. So that's not going to be the problem once it's in play. So just the way we work tends to limit surprises. But at the same time, you're always anticipating, or there's a certain degree of guessing at how something's going to function with grass versus how you think it's going to. And more often than not, those things work out pretty well. And every once in a while, you find that you might want to make a tweak here and there.
Jasper, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, no. I was just thinking that. I mean, I think with Brian, most of the listeners will be aware of the approach that's now become kind of the standard for proper golf course construction and design is design shape. So it's just to that point, the fact that you are on site almost on a daily basis, making sure that things every step of the way are right and dialed in, as opposed to just coming out, holding out some plans and pointing into the mid distance for a few photographs, and then signing it off at the end make a big difference. But maybe that's a good segue into Old Barnwell, one of Brian's most recent projects, and some of the shaping there is quite unique. So yeah, maybe that's a good way to get into that.
The question I have about Old Barnwell is, you have this situation where how did you win the contract for Old Barnwell? Was it what was the process of being able to take on a golf course as a golf course designer, particularly as one that was working with someone else as a head lead designer, lead architect? How did that process operate for you, and how did you get to that position of being able to open Old Barnwell?
Yeah, Old Barnwell was a project I did with a good friend of mine, Blake Conant, who's worked with us for a long time, began as an intern with us and has evolved into a really talented shaper and designer, and a really good friend. Our version of the story is a little different than the version that our client, Nick Schreiber, likes to tell. Nick talks about it as though he wanted Blake and I to design the golf courses from the get-go, and we really didn't have that impression until much later on. And to Nick's point, he intended to build 2 golf courses and was going to have me do one and Blake do the other. And we never quite had that inkling either. We just assumed we were in it together. But it started, Nick was searching. Nick lives not far from me here in Charleston, South Carolina. So Nick was looking for a sandy piece of property somewhere in the southeast of America, and was pretty diligent about, investigating any property that was up for sale at the time, from Georgia through South Carolina, up into North Carolina, really. And eventually, after a lot of searching, settled on a piece of property in Aiken, South Carolina, which is just about 2 hours from where I live. But Nick had reached out to Blake initially because Blake had, I think, on Golf Club Atlas, the website, posted something about there being a bunch of sandy ground in the southeast. So Nick had reached out to Blake and said, saw your post. I'm looking for a piece of land. Do you have any specific sites you've seen? And Blake connected Nick and I because we live nearby one another, and Blake lives in Omaha, which is a bit of a flight from here. So he thought it'd be handy for us to hook up, and I could help Nick kind of sort through some of these local properties together. And Blake was involved in that too. But, it just started that way, that here's a nice young guy that wants to build a golf course, and if we can be helpful, great. And obviously in the back of your mind, you're thinking, well, if this works out, we might be able to design a building for him. But that wasn't explicit early on in any way. So we spent a lot of time helping Nick find a site, and eventually he said, yeah, this one will be really good. And by that time, I guess it was kind of assumed that we'd be involved. But it just turned out that obviously Blake and I knew each other well and are comfortable working together, and just thought we would design it together. And then there was a point pretty early on where, Nick said, this is great, you guys will do the first golf course, but kind of everyone's telling me that I should probably pick another designer for the second course, so I think that's what I'll do. And I said, okay, yeah, I understand that. I mean, that's kind of conventional wisdom these days. You use 2 different architects, you can market it differently and all that. And I said, but that just humor me. Let's each go home and we'll each make a list. You make a list of the 36-hole clubs in America where they hired 2 different designers. And I'll make a list of all the clubs that just use the same designer for 36 holes. And if you do that exercise yourself, it's pretty easy to see that I won. And apparently that was enough for Nick to change his mind and say, all right, fine, you guys can do both golf courses. So he's been a dream client in every way. He's a wonderful guy, and his vision for the club is really an exciting thing to be a part of. And again, the freedom he gave us to build the sort of golf that we wanted to build was more than we would have asked for.
So maybe just on that, Brian. Old Barnwell obviously has made a massive splash. It's opened up acclaim. Everybody's excited about it. It's something new and different, which you don't get often in golf. Then you've got the children's course. I don't know if it's still called that or if it's been marketed a different way. But then also
Kids course.
Kids course.
Yeah, just very simply. Yeah.
Kids course. And then just so everybody's aware, there's also the second course is not the kids course, but there's still another in the pipeline.
Yes, there's space for another full 18-hole course.
So that's a plan. When are you planning to start work on the second 18?
Whenever Nick tells us, which we'll see. The club is doing really well. I hope he waits a few years. I'd like people to just kind of really enjoy what's been built so far and start to get bored with that before you give them another shiny new toy.
So you just finished the kids course.
And even the main course, the main course only opened a year ago.
But have you just finished the kids course? Am I right?
Yes. Yeah. We built that this summer, built it and grassed it. And we had a pretty good storm a couple of weeks ago that might have knocked back a few holes, but the plan is to open up. The club has been closed for the past couple of months through the summer here. So it reopens in September. And at that point, hopefully most or all of the kids course will be ready to play.
Right. Okay. Let's get nerdy on Old Barnwell, right? You've got a site that you've been offered. He took you to the site. What was your first impression of the site?
It was, largely treed at that point. So, a portion of the site was, just smaller pines, but it was all pines. But there were parts of the site where you could kind of see some of the longer views and other places where you just couldn't see more than 50 yards in front of you. So the topo map was important, as it usually is. But, the size of the site, the size of the features, it's a pretty gentle piece of land on the uplands, but the uplands are divided by a big deep valley that has a couple little tributaries running into it, and that's kind of the dominant feature of the site is this broad deep valley. Going through the process with Nick of essentially turning down a bunch of sites that he thought might be appealing and finally settling on this one. There's a little bit of pressure that comes with that. When you say, yeah, this is the one you should buy. You can do something really neat with that. And it's up to us to do something really neat with that. So there's a little pressure built into that. But the first impression was, soils were sandy, which was important to all of us. And there's enough space to work around that deep valley in a way where you're not constantly walking up and down hills. It's pretty warm in this part of the country, and we wanted walkability to be an important part of the experience there. So, feeling comfortable that we could find a routing that accomplishes all the things we want to accomplish was important. And Blake and I, both together and independently, spent a lot of time sorting out where the golf holes should live and how to connect them together, and went through a lot of changes over the course of 6 or 8 months before essentially settling on what you play today. But
I loved the routing. I thought the routing, particularly dealing with the valley, was absolutely fantastic. And I would love to know, where were your tricky areas within the routing? Where were areas that you struggled to work out the method to maybe cross the valley or deal with the valley, or even a flatter area up at the top?
Yeah, again, the valley was the trickiest part. We had golf on one side and we had golf on the other, and had to connect those two some way. And the valley's broad enough that it's hard to play a tee shot across it. You're either playing through it or down into it and back up. And we didn't want to do that any more than we had to. So yeah, the trick was getting from one side of the valley to the other without climbing up and down too much. And the valley itself was about 60 60 to 70 feet deep when we started, and there's, I think, 120 or so feet of elevation change from the high point in the first fairway down to the seventh green is the low spot, 8 tees. So it starts out pretty gently, and then you're down through the valley, kind of straight downhill for 5, 6, 7, and that gets you to the lowest point, and then you're kind of slowly working your way back up. But we managed to do it in a way where they're really, the eighth hole plays uphill a bit, though it's deceptively uphill. But the rest of the holes are relatively gentle or even downhill, and there aren't many climbs from green to tee. So it's kind of a gradual walk back up, and then we used the 16th hole was a hole where we had to do a lot of work to get you back from one side of the valley to the other. That's a kind of mid-length par 5. So that was the hole that really made the rest of the routing work in a way that minimized the up and down.
Was there any holes that you just went, okay, this is this hole, and then we have to keep this hole because this is brilliant?
There are a few of those. The sixth hole is one that which took a lot of work for drainage reasons more than anything. But the sixth hole is the one that we found pretty early on. We found the spot where the 6 tees sit now, and it's just a view straight down the valley, and felt like, boy, this is a shot that people probably want to hit. And for a while, we thought about that being the clubhouse site and kind of working out from there. But as it turned out, we crammed a lot of golf in that one spot. There are, I think, 3 greens and 3 sets of tees in that one point. So that was clearly, a spot that we honed in on as being the place you want to get golfers spending a bunch of time. And then it's just kind of working out, how do we get to this point in an interesting way, and then how do we leave it and get back to it, and then get you back to where the clubhouse ended up. Which is, such a fun part of the process. Working with Tom Doak for 20 years, he doesn't necessarily need our help with sorting out a routing. So we got a little bit of practice with that, and Tom's really generous about involving us in every way. But to have the chance to do it ourselves, Blake and I, it's just a fun, exciting process. I mean, that's where you're finding the golf holes.
I thought the 6, 7, 8, 9 was absolutely spectacular. What a loop of holes you built there, just across the valley essentially. But yeah, you've built this wonderful loop where you never feel like you're walking uphill. You've done a great job there.
Thank you. Yeah, the 9th is another one that we found pretty early on, and that hole didn't take a lot of work, but that's another hole that we felt like we wanted to include in the routing, and then 7 and 8 just kind of fell into place from there.
Yeah, the green site on 8 is it's spectacular, but it's so difficult. If you're trying to play into that green site, you have to be pretty accurate, or you're finding yourself in a tricky spot.
There's a little bit of that throughout the golf course, hopefully.
Yeah.
And hopefully in a way that you don't get it all the first time around. That after you've played it once, you say, "Oh, I would play this totally different the next time." And then as the whole locations change from day to day, you'll slowly uncover more ways to play it well.
Well, that's something I found really interesting, is the greens were not just on brilliant sites, but they were incredibly well shaped in terms of each green had a different, almost not vibe, but feel about it, and a different, it was always a different setting. There's always a different style of shape to it. I thought that was brilliantly done. Really interesting set of greens. And are you quite happy? Were you very proud of the fact that you were able to manage to do that? Because not many golf courses can.
Thanks. Yeah, it's something we work really hard on, and feel like variety throughout the set is really important. That having some greens that are just very simple tilts without much contour, others that have significant contour, some small, some big. That's one of the elements that helps distinguish each golf hole from one another. It's not just the way the holes are laid on the property that makes them different. It's also the features you build, and the greens being the most important part of that. So I like golf courses where you walk off afterwards and you can remember most, if not all, of the greens. And that, I think, I don't know that we ever verbalized that, but that was certainly something that was important to us, that the greens are also one of the distinguishing characteristics of the course as a whole, but but for each of the individual holes that they each presented something different. And I think it's important at a private club that, that some or most of the greens have enough hole locations where you can move it around from day to day and the hole can play completely differently. The place where people tend to play often at a members club, I think that's a really important part of the architecture.
Is it, sorry,
variability.
Tell me if I'm thinking about it wrong, but the 6th had a little mound in the middle of the green. Is it the 6th?
It's got a little mound in the front corner. Yeah,
front corner. And so wherever you have that pin position, is it you're almost having to, it's a wide open fairway and you're playing to a left or right to try and play into that hole. But it was a reoccurring theme every single time I'd go down to play my second approach shot. And I'd be like, oh, bugger, I wish I was over there. Even though it's wide open. I've hit a good drive. I'm wrong side. It was a brilliant example of having wide fairways, allowing you to play your driver, play well off a tee without having too much. I've played a few courses recently where fairways have been like this, and new courses where you just have no chance of, if you're a bad driver, there's no chance of even playing the hole. And was that a real inspiration? That I know Tom Doak's very proud of the fact that he does that a lot, where you have these big wide open fairways. Why is that so important to modern day architecture?
Searching for golf balls is a drag, and losing them's even worse. Searching for your playing partner's golf balls is the worst thing of all. It's fun to be able to stand on the tee and swing freely because you don't have the fear of losing a ball. There's not much stress in that. I don't enjoy playing golf courses where you stand on every tee and you feel like you could be reloading. That's just not fun to me. But at the same time, there have to be consequences for drives that aren't hit to the proper spot. So you can have a 60 or 70 yard wide fairway, but if you're on the right half versus the left half, you should have a very different shot coming into the green. And the 6th hole is an interesting example. I mean, obviously, depending on where the pin is on the green itself, the 6th at Old Barnwell is just pretty simple. It's just kind of a tilt that falls towards the back. There's not a lot of contour in it, but you mentioned that little knob front right, which is something you have to negotiate. Some people prefer to play left. Some people prefer to play right based on the shot you want to hit. To me, the best holes are the ones that don't have an obvious answer for everyone. That you may choose to play it one way, whereas I think that's backwards, and I do the opposite based on my game. But based on the shot you want to hit off the tee, if you fail to execute that, there need to be consequences that make the next one harder. So, the wide fairways create angles into greens. They also let you find your ball and just keep moving and play quickly. But at the same time, there need to be consequences to misplayed shots, and that tends to happen around the greens. We give you a lot of place to play at a lot of space to play at Old Barnwell, but the greens, if you miss in the wrong spot, or if you're coming in from the wrong angle, you've got to work to make your par.
So just
sorry, on you go, Jasper.
I was going to ask you just a question on that, Brian. So you talked about finding holes. So you have this like canvas, and you and Blake are out there, and you think, we need to hit that drive. Like that needs to be the case. These are where the tee is going to be. So when it actually comes to building a green, so you have this blank canvas, think, it needs to be about this far. We want to hit that drive. We want to hit it. So then you say, okay, this location. So when it comes to actually deciding this is location of the green site, we talked about good green locations. From an architect's point of view or a shaper's point of view, how many of the greens at Old Barnwell were found in situ, and you're thinking those natural contours are great? Or how many of them did you look at and you say, do you know what? That's a brilliant tee shot, brilliant approach, but we're going to have to do some serious stuff here to get a green that works. Mm-hmm. So I'm not framing the question right, but how many are found, then how many are constructed? And if you do have to construct, how do you go about doing that?
It's a mixture. There are some greens. The 10th is a good example, and the 18th, where the natural ground was just tilting at 2 to 3 to 4%, which is perfect for a green, and tilting in a direction not towards you. The 10th tilts pretty hard right to left. The 18th falls to the back left corner. Those greens are almost entirely as we found them. And the hole was kind of, at least in part, designed around the tilt of the greens, kind of giving you a bunch of space to play safely. In both cases, if you bail out to the right, you've got a much tougher shot coming in, but you've got all the room in the world out the right. If you hug the treble up the left for the better angle, you've got to be more precise with your tee shot. And then there are other holes where, like 16 I mentioned, that was just creating a green site from scratch halfway up a 50-foot hillside. And then you're just kind of digging into your memory banks to think of cool holes you've seen that solve that problem in an interesting way, and riffing off that. And then there's stuff in between where you feel like this is a good spot for a green. Now, how do we contour it or cant it in a way that makes, again, there's some repercussions for how you hit your tee shot. You're accentuating what the topography and the landing area is doing, perhaps, by contouring the green in a certain way. And sometimes it's risk reward. Sometimes, it's just building interesting contour in and around the green that make for an interesting shot, regardless of where you're coming in from. So every hole you're presenting a different puzzle to solve, and sometimes you're rewarding the guy that can hit it really far. Other times you're rewarding somebody who can find a particular spot in the fairway, regardless of how they hit it. There are a lot of holes at Old Barnwell where we tried to use the topography in a way where if you want to hit the ball 300 yards or more, you're going to have to deal with a blind shot or an awkward lie. There are a lot of holes that are relatively level, 220 yards off the tee, but as you get to 300, you've got a pretty strong tilt that's kicking you down the hill into a tough angle or to a spot where you just can't see for your next shot. So we let long hitters wail away. We give them space to do that, but there's some kind of unseen complication that might make their second shot tough.
I've actually, on that point, I want to say that probably the best new hole that I've played recently was the 14th, and which is possibly one of the coolest holes I've played full stop. I loved it. I thought it was a really engaging golf hole where it's not a difficult green. It's not that. It's about the fact that you can go for it, but you're dead if you screw it up. Explain the situation with the 14th. Was that already there, or did you build that mound that the green sits on?
That one took a fair bit of work. We had an idea for that hole pretty early on based off the second hole of the National Golf Links, which is one of my favorite short holes in the world. There's a lot more topography at the National than we had, but we tried to build in just enough depth to the kind of the big facing bunker and enough height to the green to make sure that there was some severity to it. That's one of those holes that people I think are still trying to figure out the best way to play it. I mean, there's most days almost everyone can take a crack at the green, and where the tee set up based on what the wind is doing that day is important too. If nobody can make the carry, then everybody's bailing out to the right. That's not as much fun. If everyone can drive the green with a 3-wood or a long iron, that's not much fun either. So there's definitely a trick to setting up that hole based on the daily conditions to make it interesting for people. But hopefully there is a decision to be made. And, I think there's enough severity and trouble around the green to ensure that it's not an easy decision to just go for it, because if you miss, you might end up making a bogey. Whereas if you choose to just play safely off the tee, you should make a 4 every time and might grab a 3 every once in a while. But that hole took a fair bit of work. Initially, we're going to play 13 as a par 3, and end up extending that hole into a par 4, which kind of gave us 2 options for where the tee could live on 14 as well. So there's a right-hand tee and a left-hand tee, which also kind of builds in the variability from day to day for member play. But it was important to us. We love short par 4s. I think most people love short par 4s. And the golf course only has 3 par 3s. So we also built The second, the ninth, and the 14th are all par fours, but generally under 300 yards or even under 270 most days for the average player. So 14 plays as a par three, 3.5 a lot of days, and the others do as well. So for good players, there's nearly 6 par threes out there as opposed to the 3 on the card. But all 3 of those short par fours are also holes where you can get yourself in a lot of trouble and walk away with a bogey or worse if you don't execute properly.
Was that very intentional to only have 3?
Nope. No. I think in my own mind, I went into it, kind of thinking of some of Colt's great courses in England, and I really love those great Heathland courses with 5 par threes. To me, that's a nice way to help the golfer remember the round. The par threes kind of break up the round, and individually they're memorable holes, but you also think, oh, it's the one before that par 3 or the one after that. So in my own mind, I was thinking it'd be fun to have 5 par 3s. But once we got into routing the golf holes, and there are points in the property where we want to get to the 7th green. We also want to get to the 15th green. Those are a long way apart from one another, and linking the holes together, you try to keep things as tight as you can, but to get to the points we wanted to get to throughout the property just meant that the holes got to be a little longer than we expected.
Did you intend 13 to be a par 3?
Initially, that was going to be a par 3. Yeah, the tee shot was essentially just going to be kind of playing from the existing tee to the crest of the hill. That was going to be a 210 or 20 yard par 3 up the hill. And then you just walk over to the left and play 14. And Blake and I think we're just kind of strolling around the woods one day back behind what we thought was the 13th green, and found a little ledge and a pretty steep fall off over there, and thought that would make a really good par 4. And that's probably one of our favorite par 4s on the golf course.
Sorry, Jasper, I cut you off. What was the...
Yeah, no, just as Brian was saying that, it's almost like in the modern day, we've got to the point where we understand width and angles. When Mackenzie wrote in Spirit of St. Andrews about like how to play 14 at St. Andrews, like there's 4 different lines, and then Bobby Jones is like, no, there's another one, and I'll give you option 5. And nowadays it's almost like most golf course architects worth their salt are like, yeah, no, this is the formula that we want to use. But you said something interesting, is that maybe perhaps length isn't always rewarded fully. So there's, in my mind, there's almost like A1 position where if you get it there, you get everything. You get a level lie, you get nice turf, you get full view of the pin. But it almost sounded like in some of your comments that you're like, yeah, you might well be able to drive it all the way there, but you're not getting everything even if you do it. Was that a conscious thing? And if so, why is that perhaps the next evolution in perhaps this strategic development again, or return back to it?
To me, it's more just about presenting interesting shots from as many parts of the golf hole as you can. Just if a golfer drives at 180 or 320, the next shot should be interesting and give them something to do. And that ties into width too. It's like width for width's sake is kind of silly, but if it's an interesting shot from the right side of the fairway, but also an interesting shot from 50 yards over there on the left, then it's worth having that width, as long as the next shot is interesting. And I think of greens the same way. It's like, big greens are interesting to the point where each of the hole locations you're adding with that additional space makes an interesting hole to play. If there's, you're making a green big and there's a hole location that it's like, oh, pin's over there today, that's a drag, then why have that hole location? But the 6th hole at Seminole is one of my favorites, and that's where the idea of the short hitters playing the level ground, and the closer you get to the green, the steeper it gets, to the point where if you hit it 320, you can't hold the fairway. It's going to shove you down to the right in the rough, and then you've got a really tough angle into a shallow green from there that's 20 feet above you. And that's kind of the principle we used on a handful of the holes at Old Barnwell. That if you can hit it really far if you like, but length tends to be its own reward. And if you can hit it 320 and you've got 180 yards into a par 5, yeah, there's got to be something to make that shot interesting. So it's more just about trying to present interesting shots from any point in the golf hole.
And the other question I had, that's great. Thank you so much for that. It's great insight. I just it gets me thinking, so which is nice. It doesn't happen often. So, the other thing you talked about, like on some of the green sites, the fact that you took a riff off something that you'd seen before. You like this element of a green. Have you ever built a green where you stand back and you're like, I've not seen that done before, and I think I did it really, really well. So, I mean, there's nothing new in golf, the same, but has Brian Schneider ever found something new?
So much of what we built is built on the initial idea is based on something you've seen before. It's the holes that are found, which is something I learned from Tom really early on. I remember going to Crystal Downs with him the first time I met Tom. I passed through Traverse City, and he took me to the Downs, and we played golf. And that's just a perfect example of a found golf course that has some really funky holes out of necessity, just the way Mackenzie routed it. It's like, well, I like this hole, I got to connect those two, and well, that's different, but that gets me from here to there. And I remember asking Tom something like, well, can you explain to me why minimalism is better than having $40 million and building Shadow Creek? Like, wouldn't you rather just build what you want to build? And his explanation was, Shadow Creek doesn't have any of those holes that you've never seen before. It's a great golf course, and everything is really well done, but it's really hard for the human brain to imagine things you've never seen before. And if you're just committed to finding a routing on an interesting piece of land without moving much of earth, you're going to come into some things that just solve a problem in a unique way that you've never seen before. And I think that probably extends to greens too. The third green at Ballyneal is a good example where, that I don't deserve any more credit than just operating a machine as Tom told me what to do. But that's one that Tom stared at for a while. And the seventh at Ballyneal is a short par 4, dog legs left a little bit. And there's just, the green sat in a little trough, high shoulder on the right, high shoulder on the left. And Tom chose to leave the shoulder on the left and just run short grass all the way up, and then build some bunkers into the hillside on the right that ended up, they call it the E green because it's kind of shaped like a capital E. And that's one I'd never seen anything like that before, and it tends to be one that people really love when they play it. But that was Tom just kind of, I don't know where the idea came from in his head, but he said, all right, get the digger, let's build a couple bunkers. And an hour and a half later, it was done.
I do have one last question about Old Barnwell before we move on, but I've got an idea of where that came from. The pit at North Berwick. It's got the big bank on the left and then the wall. So instead of having the wall, you have the bunkers, and you're kind of playing. You can play it in off the left, but then it's the less control, and you're starting to play with the beach left of that. I don't know. Just a thought.
You might be right. Yeah, I'd like to ask Tom about that. I don't recall him ever saying, when we're working, we speak in terms of golf holes a lot. It's like, I'm kind of thinking this is 17 a deal. I don't remember him alluding to anything specific as we were doing that green, but yeah, you could do worse than riffing off of 13 at North Berwick.
The reason I bring North Berwick, I'm a member at North Berwick, so I bring it in all the time. But the reason I use North Berwick as an example at Old Barnwell, it goes back to what you're talking about in memorability with par threes. I think what Old Barnwell did extremely well, and I genuinely I was blown away by this, was the amount of views that were very memorable views from different spots in the course and different holes. It was visually so appealing. It meant that you remembered golf holes and remembered standing in spaces because of it was the views really. And I know for a fact that, not fact, but I think it was the green at 15 was the only section of 15 that you had a view, because there was trees growing on either side. Was that intentional, or was the fact that you just kind of built the golf holes and were like, oh wow, this place is visually, the views are amazing?
You definitely factor that in. The backdrops to the holes, the looks you get across the property. And 15 being kind of secluded by itself through the trees. You get a peek once you get to the green, but we also wanted the reveal. It's a blind tee shot on 16, essentially up to the top of a hill, and then you get to the top of the hill and you're seeing the whole property and the run back into the clubhouse. That was very much intentional too. Just kind of playing away from the valley for a few holes. Really, once you leave 12 green, you're back through the trees, not really looking at the big open expanse around the valley until you get back to the top of the hill on 16. You've got this big reveal, and then you can see 17 and 18 back to the clubhouse. People seem to take a lot of photos of that look from up there. So
I think pretty sure I've got one.
So I know you said, James, that we were going to try and move on from Old Barnwell, but I got one more question for Brian on it, and it's not particularly just Old Barnwell, but if you follow Brian on X or Twitter, it is like one of the best follows you can have because you get unadulterated just pure gold on a golf course architecture front, especially some of the replies to some more ludicrous comments that are sometimes left. So if nothing else, it's a learning experience, but also a bit of entertainment.
I should probably
Where
stick
I'm going with this.
Keep my trap shut.
So there was one reply to a comment that was left, something to the effect of like Old Barnwell was a minimalist course, to that effect, and the response was that effectively, if that's what your definition of minimalism is, then it's different than what mine is, or that's not minimalism. So, well, I think with Renaissance, obviously because of the backdrop of much of the work that is very well known, I know that a lot of earth isn't moved on a lot of holes, and then on a small number of holes, and maybe there is a lot of work that's moved to make things work. So how would you define like minimalism or naturalism? So in your mind, how does that work? What? Because I think a lot of people think that it's synonymous, where perhaps the reality of it is not. So I just wanted to see from your point of view what those two things were and how they relate to perhaps what you've done recently.
Yeah, I don't know if I just have a different definition or if I think a lot of people misunderstand minimalism. I do think for the most part, Old Barnwell is minimalist work. There are 3 holes, 16, 6 and 7, the holes that play through the valley, where we did have to do a lot of work, but that was geared around drainage. That big valley, just water moved very slowly. It's very nearly flat for the better part of a quarter mile, half mile. So we had to do a lot of work just to move water around there. Most of the rest of the holes, 14 took some work, but most of the rest of the holes are really kind of from tee to green, laying largely as we found them. But I've seen some people lump Old Barnwell in with some places where they moved way more dirt than we did, built very dramatic features. And I think people look at it and say, "Oh, you built these kind of wild-looking bunkers and these mounds and things. It's kind of a maximalist design." And I don't really, to me, that's something very different. To me, minimalism is not a style of architecture, but an approach to design and construction, where you're trying to find as many golf holes as you can without moving a bunch of dirt. And then to your point, maybe there's 2 or 3 holes you've got to do some significant work to connect things, or maybe like Crystal Downs, you just say, well, we're just going to play this chunk of land as we find it and try to make it interesting in more subtle ways. To me, it's less about the style of the features than the approach to construction. And the routing is a huge part of minimalism. Just because Maxwell that said, find a great piece of land and do as little to it as possible. But people seem to lump in, wow, they built really deep bunkers, or they've got these funny berms, or this wild cluster of bunkers as maximalism, and I just don't see it that way. To me, it's more about the amount of work you're doing to create interesting golf. And most of the holes at Old Barnwell were just little bits of shaping and not massive amounts of earthwork.
How did you make Victorian berms cool? That's bloody impressive.
I hope they're cool.
Like, I just appeared on the golf course and I was like, what is going on here? It felt so bizarre. I've seen them in like council courses in England. It's like that. It was very bizarre to see them.
Yeah, I love that sort of thing. And there's obviously been a trend towards a certain aesthetic in American golf architecture in recent years, largely because Bill Coore and his guys do such beautiful work that people are like, I want to do that. Like, that looks great. I don't think Tom is quite as, he's not as easily pigeonholed, but I think, Coore and Crenshaw definitely have their style, and it's gorgeous in every way. So people have adopted that look to a certain degree, which has resulted in a lot of, big waste areas, big bunkers, more sand than grass. And we just wanted to get away from that. There are a few modern courses that have that to the extreme, big wide fairways, big sandy bunkers. And when I play some of those golf courses, if you've got a huge wide open bunker next to fairway, to the degree to which you're comfortable playing a long iron out of a bunker, those shots aren't all that different. So there's really no penalty. It's like, well, I'll just aim up the middle. If I end up in the grass or in the middle of that massive bunker, my next shot's going to be pretty easy regardless. So, we thought a lot about bunker size, and there are quite a few bunkers at Old Barnwell, but a lot of them are pretty small. And, if a bunker is really big and easy to recover from, it doesn't really have much value. If you've got a cluster of small bunkers where you can end up against a lip or not have a backswing, you're going to try and avoid that thing. So it's got a lot more value as a hazard. So we tried to, get away from, kind of this really popular trend of building these big waste area bunkers and, shrink the scale. There are places where we have a lot of sand in a certain area, but it's not just one big bunker. It's broken up into smaller clusters. So, there's some variability in the lie you're going to get. You might get a good lie, you might get a terrible lie, but you have to respect that hazard because you could end up having to punch out sideways. And you don't see that very often. That's something we wanted to reintroduce. So the style of the bunkering kind of led to the berms as well. Some of those are aesthetic, on the first hole, there's the diagonal berm. You have to carry off the first tee. That's just kind of setting the stage for, we might see some different things out here. And, there's another one behind the 10th green that, as much as anything, it's just blocking the ugly stepped in tees behind it for the 11th hole. We built the 11th tees, and we'd always loved the view of the 10th, just how quiet and gentle it was. And then we built the tees on 11 in a way, we tried to keep them as subtle as we could, but we just ended up with these stair steps and thought, well, let's just build a berm across there and we'll hide it. That'll be cool. And then there are places where they come into play as hazards. So there are places where they're just an aesthetic flourish, and other places where they actually come into play and are meaningful. Instead of just building another bunker to serve the same purpose.
There's a great joke in Scotland that Americans never learned how to make bunkers, and it goes back to that point that you're making about your bunkering. I remember chipping out a few bunkers because of the fact that they are severe slopes and they're small. You haven't built big expanses of things that you can play onto greens with no real difficulty at all. Is that a thing that you say is very Brian Schneider to do?
No, I'm just stealing that idea from a lot of the places you get to play back home.
No, I know, but is it something that would be a philosophy of yours? You want to make bunkers a hazard, not a... Would that be something going forward that you're going to concentrate on?
Yes. Yeah, I think if you're going to build a bunker, then it should serve a purpose. And again, if it's an easy recovery 9 times out of 10, then people don't respect that as a hazard. But if you're punching out 4 times out of 10, then you're going to try to avoid it as much as you can.
You've just made me a very happy man.
There's been a lot of pushback against some of the bunkers out there, and it's just like, there's 60 yards of fairway over there. You don't have to get anywhere near it. Of course, I, as much as anyone, don't hit it where I intend to. So it's easier to say that than to do it. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, the bunkers are meant to be, they're meant to be impactful, and we try to build impactful bunkers.
Do you think that's a psyche in America that if it was water or another form of, just water is really the other option, or rough that was just too long and horrid, they wouldn't have the same pushback?
Mm-hmm. I think so. Yeah, Tom has made that point about severe greens, that golfers hate 3-putting if they miss on the wrong part of a green, have to negotiate a big contour in the middle, but they're perfectly happy to accept a pond right next to the green where they lost a ball and they're dropping, make a bogey that way. There's something psychological about that, but I think you can also use that against the golfer in certain ways. And again, we had the support of our client at Old Barnwell, who just let us build it where we want and has been a great defender of our work, saying, oh, well, if you don't like the golf course, then you don't have to join. And we'll find somebody else who appreciates it. And fortunately, that's gone over well, and the membership is full, and they seem to enjoy the golf course. But anytime you start a project, and even throughout the project, you're just building. At least Blake and I, we're just building the kind of golf that we enjoy playing, and then you just cross your fingers and hope that resonates with enough people to fill the membership and keep the place busy. But you're not really thinking about, boy, how are people going to react to this? Are people going to like this? This is similar to that hole that people seem to hate. You're just building golf that you think is fun and golf holes you want to play, and then hopefully other people like that same style of golf.
The last question I have about Old Barnwell is sorry, I can't stop. I love that place. I truly do. The philosophy of the place, the golf course, everything you guys, or Nick and you've done, is just really built something that you don't get in America. That I know for a fact that a lot of the reviews on the top 100 websites say it's unique. And it's a fresh take on things that you won't see anywhere else. And that must be a really quite refreshing and cool thing to be able to read about your own golf course design. But the one thing that you won't ever get away from, and I don't think, maybe you will, but it's the fact that you have a golf course built at the same time by your old master just down the road in the same sandy soils and tree farm. And I know, never heard of it. Good. Okay, we'll move on. And every time someone speaks to you, you probably get compared or talked about this. It's a main topic. I know for a fact that a lot of people are asked, what do you prefer, Tree Farm, Old Barnwell? It's a very common conversation if you've been to that area. And do you think that's good for the area, the fact that there's discussion around different golf courses that are getting, or do you think that the comparison doesn't help the golf course, or it might drag one up or one down? Or what's your thoughts on the whole kind of situation you have there?
I think it's good that people are talking about both golf courses. I don't, I understand it, but I wish people could get away from the comparison. And the one is better than another, or which do you prefer? Which is inevitable. I mean, people have that conversation about Shinnecock and National, or Cypress and Pebble. I mean, it's an easy conversation to have, and it's a fun conversation to have. But they're very different golf courses, and very different clubs with very different goals. And I love Tree Farm, and I've kind of got a long history with that property, and had hoped to build a golf course there at one point. I love that piece of land. It's a beautiful piece of ground, and it's a very different piece of ground than, in spite of the similar soils and the similar vegetation, the topography is really different than Old Barnwell, and the way the golf course, the way the routing works around that property is very different too. They've got more up and down within their holes, whereas our holes tend to be a little gentler. And the features they built are very different there too. So I think it's great that both places exist. I think it's great that they're both getting attention, and the extent to which people comparing them helps, again, draw more attention to that area for golf, I think is a good thing. And I hope the comparisons encourage people to see both while they're in the area, because they're two very different golf experiences. And I think they're both, to a certain degree, unique. places that are worth seeing because they offer some things that maybe you haven't seen before. I think they knocked it out of the park at Tree Farm. And Tom's involvement with the routing actually was important. He's really good at that. But Zach was very involved, and is really sharp about architecture. And Kai Golby is a really old friend of mine. I learned from Kai before I learned from Tom. I worked for Kai for the better part of a year before I started working for Tom. And Kai's as talented as anyone in the business. Then it's really cool that he got that opportunity and knocked it out of the park and is getting more opportunities on kind of the heels of Tree Farm. And I'm really thrilled about that.
There's a lot of golf being built around Aiken. A lot of people getting excited to the space, or not just Aiken, but that whole area. There's a lot of golf courses being built. And obviously there's that sand belt that everyone's getting excited over. Mm-hmm. Do you think as an area it's going to just grow and grow and grow and become, I'm not going to say Pinehurst because it's not a good comparison, but in terms of the number of golf courses that will pop up in that area, because it's not a big area in terms of the town of Aiken's not big. Mm-hmm. Do you think the infrastructure, the space, everything is going to be put under pressure with the amount of golf or the amount of visitors, or what's your honest opinion about that area and how it can expand?
Aiken's a really charming town. I don't know if you got to spend any time there.
Loved Aiken.
It's a really neat little place.
Go hang out in the alley, have a few drinks.
Yes. Yeah. Wilcox for a nightcap.
Yeah.
No, it's a great little town. And, to me, Aiken's an amenity of those clubs, the proximity to the town, and it takes some pressure off the clubs to build a bunch of lodging because many people are equally comfortable and enjoy spending time in Aiken. That's important. That's important that you don't have to open day one with 60 beds, and 2 years in, you don't need 60 beds necessarily. That people want to be in town. And I think Aiken could probably use another high-end hotel or inn to help support that. It is a small town, and the options there are somewhat limited. How much golf that area can support long-term is a much bigger question. And how many of these, Old Barnwell and Tree Farm aren't necessarily destination clubs in the way that, places like Ohoopee and Childress Hall and Ballydale and Sandhills. I mean, there are far more remote places in America, and I don't know the extent to which golf can continue to support that many of those sorts of destination clubs when and if this boom we're all enjoying comes to an end. But I'm glad there's a lot of great golf being built and sandy sites and by people who want to do something really interesting. And there's certainly been a lot of construction lately, and the number of truly interesting golf courses being built right now is higher than it's been in a long time. So we're all fortunate for that. What the economic future of that model is, I have no idea how that plays out, but I'm glad they're being built, and I hope they all survive and thrive.
Well, there's so many. I'm sorry. Just continuing on that topic you're just talking about. Obviously, there's been a Doak, Core Crenshaw, Gil Hance kind of umbrella of the three great guys. You want to come in, do your golf course. They're all now at a stage where they've had people like yourself who've been associates at all their designs and constructions who are now coming out and wanting to do their own thing, like what you've had the opportunity at Old Barnwell. And there's a lot of exciting characters who are coming out of that space. I know, like yourself, I know Angela has just done amazing work at number 10 and different thing. Well, even Clyde as well, Clyde Johnson. It's going to be tough for these people because each person had about 3 or 4 key associates, right? Is it going to be a market where we're in this boom right now? So people are going to try and get a good golf course, their calling card onto the table, like you've done with Old Barnwell. Come look at what I've done. Here's my business card. is it going to be a tough fight for different opportunities within the space, particularly building new courses that are already tough trying to get in? What's your opinion on that space?
Yeah, it's an exciting time for, kind of the next folks down after the big three, really. Tom is as busy as he's ever been, and Bill Coore, I think, is busier than he's ever been. Obviously, Gil, I don't know how he does all the work he does and does it as well as he does. So those guys are really busy, and I look forward to continuing to work with Tom on his projects, because I don't think he's slowing down anytime soon. But it is exciting for, personally, for Blake and I to get the opportunity that we had at Old Barnwell, and hopefully we'll have more opportunities going forward together and separately. But it's also exciting to see what these other talented young folks do and what they can add that's different than the people they've been learning from. I don't think we necessarily need more regurgitation of Bill's design philosophy or Gil's or Tom's. So it's exciting to see what kind of fresh ideas this next batch of people come up with, because there's a lot of really creative, talented folks in that space. And it's neat that more are getting opportunities to express themselves beyond the work they've done for other people.
I think a great example of that is when people have used the word unique around Old Barnwell. And the fact that these guys, like yourself, like Clyde and the likes, are given opportunities. You are doing something that is different to what's been built for the last 15 years. So it's a very exciting time to be in the golf course architecture game, right?
It is. Yeah, it is. Yeah,
so one question with that then, and maybe this is I know we're getting on a bit, but just one more, and then we might have to save some of this stuff for hopefully another one, Brian. We can really get into the nuts and bolts of some of this architecture and all the rest of it. But so we've talked about like Old Barnwell, kind of a lot of inspiration came from courses you had seen, greens, bunker shapes, drainage, ditches, all sorts of stuff. So that's great. But you also worked on a course, the Lido, and built that. So the one thing I wanted to ask you about that, obviously sand site, amazing golf course, the original, and then to be able to recreate it as best as humanly possible as a pure restoration, if you will, although a new build. What, in the course of building that, what did you learn from an old master, even though you weren't working on his original site? But in the course of like building it, finding those shapes, those bunkers, the layout, where you just looked at it and said, wow, that's impressive. I didn't see that coming.
It's a long list.
We have to do another episode just on
That's a great question.
Yeah. It's the most fascinating and challenging project I've ever been a part of, and rewarding, and in a different way. New construction is one thing. Designing a golf course from scratch. I mean, that's designing and building a golf course from scratch is golf architecture at its purest. I mean, that's what architecture is. And then the other part of our business is restoring, renovating old golf courses, which to me is a very different thing. I mean, almost to the point that I don't think that's, if that's exclusively what you do, I don't really know that you're a golf architect. I think that's just such a different thing. It's more archaeology. It's more research. It's more, proper restoration is more just getting things right, as opposed to being creative and creating something original. And the Lido is a combination of those two things. The restoration work we do is, typically, the screen is shrunk. Let's push the green out, or the green's been rebuilt. Let's rebuild it according to these old pictures. Let's get the bunkers back. You're rebuilding features. You're not rebuilding every square inch of the property as accurately as you can. So it was restoration on a much bigger scale, and not just trying to get the greens and the bunkers right, but getting every contour and every fairway right. And that, fortunately, that's the level of information we had to work from. So that's the level of detail we could build into the golf course. But it was really intense. It just, in a different way, every night after a full day of work was going back and staring at the old photographs and reading the old articles about what part of the sixth hole you'd be working on tomorrow to make sure you got that acre of ground right.
Wow.
And my estimate, the National Golf Links has long been my favorite golf course in America and one of my 2 or 3 favorites in the world. So I've always thought very highly of McDonald, but my estimation for him grew tremendously through that project, because I don't think any other architect, living or dead, would have gone to the lengths he went to include kind of the strategic detail that he did in every part of that property, and the opportunity to create something from scratch. I have the impression there was no part of the property where he's like, yeah, just go over there and make it roly-poly. Like every fairway contour was deliberate. He had created this plasticine model prior to construction, and Rayner just nailed it. We've got a couple of aerial photographs of the early golf course, and you look at them next to the plasticine model, and it's like, in the plasticine, every fairway contour is visible, and it's the same in the aerials. He built the plasticine model, and the detail that went in the plasticine model was just extraordinary. The way that he constructed fairway contours to feed you this way or that, depending on where your ball landed and how it ran, is just really brilliant stuff. And I think it was
so. Was there any like epiphany moments where you were kind of like, you looked at the photo or you read the report, or you looked at things and you thought, okay, well, that's interesting. I don't necessarily see, like, I'll build it because that's what it was. But then you actually got into the sand and you started shaping it, and then you start looking around and you think, oh, like the penny drops as to like, this is sheer brilliance.
Yes.
And yeah.
That built, but pretty early on, the realization that, oh, we're not just building roly-poly fairways in the contour, or roly-poly contour in the fairway. It was like, shoot, we've got to be intentional about every shape we're building. That hit pretty early and was somewhat daunting. But that's where technology, GPS. A lot of articles have talked about the GPS bulldozers and that sort of thing, which were a really important part of building it efficiently. But Brian Zager, who was involved, and introducing GPS technology to ensure that in 2 dimensions, every green was exactly the same size and shape and in the same place. Every bunker was exactly the same size and shape and in the same place. But every fairway contour could be traced and put exactly where it should be. It was a laborious process, but the technology that, which I'm a Luddite completely when it comes to technology, and hope to remain so for as long as I can. But being introduced to this technology on that project was a revelation. And I don't know that we could have done it that well 10 years ago. I think this was just kind of the right point in time where we had the technology available to make it happen, and happen well, and happen fairly efficiently. It was a fascinating project for so many ways, for so many reasons. And I'm so fortunate to be involved, and to build Old Barnwell on the heels of that, I think was, there are some things at Old Barnwell. The severity of the bunkers, some of my favorite holes at Lido are really hard holes, but they're really fun and they're really memorable. And that severity definitely transferred into some of the bunkering in Old Barnwell.
So one last really geeky question for me, James and Brian, and then I'm just looking at the clock here, and we could keep on going for a while, but maybe the Lido is another one that we could talk about in more detail. So when you listen or when you read some of, like, let's say Mackenzie's, when you talked about some of the holes at Augusta National, he would say, well, this is based on the template at, the 18th at St. Andrews, or the 17th. You kind of look at it and you're like, no, I don't see that. But instead of a template hole, as in a McDonald or a Rayner type, in his notes of the early program, the 34 program, he says it's not necessarily the hole that we're replicating as a template, it's one element. So the way the green sits, or where the bunker is, that it doesn't even look the same, but it plays the same. So bringing this full stop at Lido, you've obviously got a site that's inland, it's not coastal. But But even situate, so thinking about the course, the way that it would have been originally designed, obviously there would have been a prevailing wind. Did something like that come into account on the site where you thought we have to make sure that we've got this piece of land, but that it is situated this way so that we get how just the level of detail that went into to make sure that you got that right? So I'm sure you thought about everything and that and more, but that was just one I was always curious about.
Yeah, and I think we got lucky on that a little bit. The shape of the site, it's longer in one direction than the other. It's a rectangle, but it's longer north to south than it is east to west, as the original Lido site was, kind of oriented the same way, north, south, east, west. But we just got lucky that the wind is really similar. I don't know if you've heard of wind roses that kind of show strength and direction of wind at various times of the year. We were able to compare the wind roses of the original site on Long Island to the site in Wisconsin, and in both strength and direction, the wind is really similar. Lido in Wisconsin is a very windy place, and I wouldn't have expected it to be comparable to being on the Atlantic Ocean in New York, but it is. It's a really windy site, and it wasn't until we really got into building the golf holes that it became obvious to me that McDonald laid out the holes in a way that relied on the wind itself. And most importantly, 3 of the par 3s are downwind: the short, the Eden, and the Redan. None of which play easier because they're downwind. Having to hit a wedge into the short makes it that much harder. Having to hold the right half of the Eden green behind the deep bunkers is really hard downwind. So playing those holes downwind, I think, makes them tougher. And then there are 3 par 5s that play into the prevailing wind, 2 of which are very short, 6 and 7. But they rarely play short because the wind is blowing in your face. If the wind was opposite on any of those holes, they'd all be easier. But I think he very much had the wind in mind when he laid out where the holes were going to go. So the par 5s can play short if the wind's blowing the other way or if it's pretty still. But on windy days, they play as par 5s. So I'm certain that he factored that in, and just the way the holes are kind of turning around the property and attacking the wind in different ways. The original site was really compact, 115 acres, I think.
Oh wow!
So he didn't have a bunch of space to be going this way and that, but he made the kind of the counterclockwise loops essentially is what he did for both the front 9 and the back 9, and in ways that you're rarely playing more than 2 holes in a row in the same direction.
The more questions we ask, the more I have. Hopefully when we get to another time. So have you ever seen a hole that's built that's better than the original? What makes the Eden so good? Yeah, we could. I'm going to start keeping a list, and then hopefully, I know we've done this in person over a drink or 2 every once in a while, but no, it'd be nice to pick the brain. So yeah, I've got loads more questions that I wish I could ask, but I'm conscious of your time. You've been very generous, so I'm just gonna start writing them down and hand back to James, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've got a couple of pages of things written down here that I could keep going. I think let's just end it. I'll end it there, and I've got one last question I'd like to finish up on every time. Everyone answers very different golf courses, but it's your top 5 favorite golf courses, not the ones that are the best, your favorites. And it doesn't have to be 5. Mm-hmm. It's just, I've had someone say 13.
The Old Course is my favorite course in the world. And amazing to me that a place that old managed to get that many things right. And just the style of golf that you get to play there is unique to that place, and it's the most enjoyable style of golf I think you could hope to play. So the Old Course is just in a class of its own. I mentioned the National earlier, which, like Lido, just the more you get to know it, the more things you find that you appreciate the genius behind it. The way it was routed, the use of the topography, it's just, there's so much brilliance out there that you can't get sick of it. And right next door is Shinnecock. I think if I was pressed to name the best golf course in the world, that might be it. And it's a place I got to work for a summer and played a lot of golf there and got really comfortable. And it's a hard golf course, but I played it enough and was playing well enough at the time that I got really comfortable playing there and really enjoyed it. Cypress Point's a place I've not been back to in too long, but it's hard not to love Cypress. I've been to Royal Melbourne a couple times in the past few years, one of which with Mike Clayton and Clyde, where we basically had the entire property to ourselves for an afternoon and just wandered around hitting golf shots. The past couple of times I've played it, the combination of the architecture and the conditions made it as good as any golf course I've ever played. So it's tough to beat. And then, there are places like North Berwick, which is as fun as golf can be, and sentimental favorites like Old Barnwell and Barnwell Dunes is a place that, that was the first project I got to run for Tom and lived there and built a lot of it. And, that'll always be a special place to me. But, that is the great thing about golf, isn't it? It just takes you to all these parts of the world to find new and different, interesting things. And you never run out of new places to explore and more things to talk.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I'm interrupting you there, but what golf course do you think no one's heard of that you think needs to be recognized more?
Oh boy, no one's heard of. That's gotten to be harder. That was a lot easier 20, 30 years ago when I started exploring before the internet. It was a lot harder to find the places then, but when you found them, you were all that much more excited. I took a trip through Maine like a month and a half ago on a whim and just like drove up and down the coast and saw every golf course I could. A lot of which were 9-holers. And there was this quirky little place at one of the coolest clubs I've seen called Maguntacook, which is a great name. I don't know what it means. It's probably a Native American word, but Maguntacook is this really charming, quirky 9-holer that was exactly the kind of golf course I was hoping to find in Maine. So recency bias. I don't know that many people have ever heard of Maguntacook, but for 9 holes of Maine style golf, that was about as good as it gets.
Superb.
Yeah, it's hard to find hidden gems these days, but keep trying.
It's impossible now, isn't it? I've tried my best, but Scotland seems to be completely well travelled.
Yeah,
everyone knows.
You've been everywhere.
Clyde knows every single golf course.
Yes, he does. I give him credit for that. I mean, it especially with a young family. I mean, it takes dedication to go out and do that, but it is so much fun to stumble into places like that. He and I were looking at a place in Greenland. There's a golf course in Greenland that looked really intriguing. We were together a couple of weeks ago. I we were looking into Greenland, but we found a place in Greenland we want to go. So we'll see which one of us gets to it first.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. I greatly appreciate your time. I know you're a very busy man, so genuinely, that was one of the most interesting conversations I had in a while, particularly with someone who built something that I truly was blown away by. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for the chat. It was really fun.
Thank you very much, Brian, for coming on the Top 100 Clubhouse podcast. I've been your host, James Henderson, and I hope you've all enjoyed. If you want to get in touch, it's at official Top 100 on Instagram, or we're on all the social media apps, or just James at top100golfcourses.com. And please remember, play fast, lunch slow.